What's up guys, it's Nick2. Today I wanted to make a real quick video showing you guys the Strand build that I've spent pretty much all day setting up and using thus far. I'll make a way more detailed, in-depth, and more edited video for Strand once all of the fragments are out, as I'm sure the build will be significantly better by that point and I will have a much better understanding of it, but the build that I've been using thus far is still insanely strong, and I just wanted to make this video for those of you that are looking for a build that's pretty good and that you can use until some of the fragments are out and you can just use, in the meantime. I'm honestly surprised I was able to get the build to be this functional. As you can see, the melee does actually surprisingly crazy amount of damage. Even without any melee exotic, it does a ton of damage. And on top of that, you can get your melee back really quickly if you have the right mod setup. And you can pretty much just spam your abilities back to back to back. Even with Heart of Inmost Light getting nerfed, it's still insanely strong and you can still just spam your abilities like crazy. On top of that, the build has very surprisingly good survivability, so you don't really have to worry about that all too much. You can get a ton of extra weapon damage with some mods, get your super back very quickly, and of course spam your abilities like an absolute madman. Before I get into the video, I want to give a big thanks to today's sponsor, Clash of Clans. Clash of Clans is a free-to-play mobile strategy game where you get to build and completely customize your own village in order to conquer other players. Strategically place cannons, mortars, and even champions such as the Barbarian King to defend your precious resources and to earn epic rewards. There's no wonder Clash of Clans is one of the most popular mobile games on the market and has been for well over a decade. Become the most powerful clan today by using the link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen. Huge thanks to Clash of Clans for sponsoring today's video. Alright, so let's just get into the build. Real quick, I want to give an apology. I've been awake for an incredibly long time and I've been pretty much playing all day to set this build up. I really just wanted to get this video out there as fast as possible, and I had a deadline, so I definitely apologize for the lack of editing, and I'm pretty much just going to really quickly just explain the build. In most videos it would be way more comprehensive and I would give a way more detailed explanation to a lot of things and I'd have way better editing, but I just really wanted to get this video out there for you guys, so we're just going to be a little bit more relaxed today, So starting off with the exotic, I'm using a Heart of Inmost Light. This obviously got nerfed, but it still is the king if you want some ability regeneration, and as you can see in the gameplay, you can get your abilities back insanely quickly. Alternatively to Heart of Inmost Light, if you don't really care about having your abilities up super frequently, like my main goal was to be able to just spam the melee literally on cooldown because it does so much damage, but alternatively, if you just want to use your melee every once in a while and focus a little bit more on gunplay, you can go for Syntheseps and buff your melee by over 200%, which is really good because the Strand melee does a ton of damage. Outside of those two options, there isn't really all that many exotics that I would really recommend with this build. I briefly want to touch on the new exotic, Abeyant Leap. This simply just is not good. I don't really know how else to say it. You already have Woven Mail pretty much all the time, so you don't need another way to gain it. And Drenger's Lash is just whenever you pop your barricade and it has the one thing come out. Instead of having just one line, it'll have three. So I don't really think it's worth it at all. All you're really doing is suspending with your barrier, which you can do anyways if you aim it properly. And this really just isn't worth it. Alright, so getting into the core of the build, I'm briefly just going to touch on pretty much how everything works and how it all synergizes together and just give brief explanations to everything. I'm not going to go super in depth here. I do want to mention that this build will get significantly better when we gain access to the fragments once the raid comes out. The fragments that we have right now are not particularly great, and definitely could be better. Just know that this build will get much better when we gain access to the new ones. And honestly, the build is pretty good as it is right now, so I'm really excited for when we gain access to those. Alright, so getting into the aspects, obviously we only have two choices here, but I'm just going to explain how it actually works with the build and what we're benefiting from. So the first one is Into the Fray, where whenever we destroy a tangle or we cast our super, it's going to give us Woven Mail for us and our nearby allies. And then while we have Woven Mail, it's going to give us a melee regeneration increase. I'm not sure it's all that significant, however, it is pretty good, especially because, the core of the build is to spam the melee. Woven Mail is also going to give us some damage reduction, so that's very good for survivability. In case you didn't know, how you spawn a tangle is actually just killing any enemy that's debuffed by any sort of strand, and there's 3 different debuffs. There is Sever, Unravel, and Suspend. Your melee by default is going to apply Sever. Your barricade, I guess it doesn't show right here, I think Drenger's Lash does it. Drenger's Lash is literally just that your barricade is going to suspend enemies, so that is 2 of the 3 debuffs covered by our melee and our barricade. For our grenade, we're going to be using Grapple, which is an Unravel applicator, but most of the time we don't really care about that. The main reason that we use Grapple is because if you, in midair, while you're grappling near an enemy and you press a melee button, it's basically going to give you a 4th melee, and it does a ton of damage, and we can get the cooldown extremely low on Grapple. On top of that, you can do this really cool thing where if there's a tangle on the ground, you can grapple to the tangle over and over, and it's going to fully recharge your grapple. So you can basically grapple to the tangle, melee, move back a little bit, grapple back to it, and then just spam a melee indefinitely if enemies are like spawning out of an area. And then you could also grapple to it, pick up the tangle, and then throw it on the ground, which is very satisfying. And also grapple is just insanely cool. I mean, why would you not use this? When it comes to the fragments, like I said, most of them kind of suck, but one that is really good is Thread of Fury, which is going to give you melee energy anytime that you damage a target with a tangle. The best way to damage a target with a tangle is by picking it up and just throwing it on the ground, and it's actually going to scale with, I think, an infinite amount of mobs. It maybe has a hard cap at some point, but it seems like if I hit like 8 mobs, I'll literally get all 3 charges back. If you only hit 1 mob, you won't get a ton of energy. If you pair this with Heart of Inmost Light, giving you empowered regen, it actually stacks with that. Or not stacks, but it kind of scales off of that extra regen. So you can get full melees back by just throwing a tangle, which is very strong. The next thing that we're using is Thread of Mind, where anytime we defeat a suspended target, it's going to give us class ability energy. This just pairs very nicely with Heart of Inmost Light so that we can spam our barrier. And the barrier is going to apply suspend, so we can, pop a barrier, kill that guy, and then we basically have our barrier back. Thread of Warding is one of the most important ones to purchase. I think this is the one that you want to purchase first, because basically you're going to give you 100% uptime on Woven Mail, which, like mentioned before, is going to reduce the cooldown of our melee. And also, it's just really good to have permanent uptime on this because it is damage reduction, so it's really good for survivability. It's very difficult to have 100% uptime on it without this because it relies on you destroying a tangle, and tangle actually has a cooldown of 15 seconds, so it's a bit difficult to fully take advantage of that. And then the last fragment that I bought is Thread of Ascent. Honestly, there's just not really anything better. I just like this because anytime we grapple, it's going to fully reload my equipped weapon. So maybe if I have a heavy out or something, I can just get a free reload, and it gives 10 mobility for free. But you could very, very easily just not even bother buying this if you wanted to buy something else with your Strand currency, whatever it's called. So don't worry too much about it. These 3 are the main ones that matter. All right, now let's get into the mods, and then afterwards I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent when it comes to the artifact mods and kind of your weapon situation. I'll get into that in a second, but firstly, let's get into mods and the rest of the build. So when it comes to the stats that you want to use, you want to go for around 100 resilience, but ultimately you only need 70 of the stats that you care about, which are resilience, discipline, and strength. This is because the new mods, the font of whatever, for example, font of vigor is going to give us strength. This effectively gives us 30 strength. So if we're at 70 plus we have font of vigor and 100% uptime on armor charges, this is effectively going to give us 100 strength. This is purely based on my testing today. It could be a number a little bit higher than that, I suppose, but based on my testing, this gives us basically tier 10 when we have 70 of any given stat. The primary way that we are going to be generating armor charge so that we can keep 100% uptime on font is going to be through heavy-handed, which is probably the best mod, I think, in the game, because anytime you get a powered melee final blow, it's just going to create an orb of power, and we're spamming our melee like crazy, and the melee in the grapple also counts as a powered one, so you just get orbs of power absolutely all over the place, and this pretty much enables you to have a crazy amount of armor charge mods. I'm just going to go piece by piece and talk about each of the mods and different options that you have, but ultimately you can take a screenshot of this if you just want to purely copy paste, but I do think there's some pretty good information in terms of which mod options that you have. So on the helmet here, I think having Font of Wisdom plus a hands-on is the best way to generate a lot of super energy, and then you just slap on a Siphon mod. If you're using a Strand weapon plus a Void weapon and you want even more orbs, which I don't entirely think you need more orbs, but if you wanted more orbs, you could swap out hands-on probably for Void Siphon. Not sure if hands-on or Font of Wisdom is better, but like I said, Font of Wisdom will give you roughly 30 intellect, so this means you get your super very, very frequently. When it comes to the gloves, we have Heavy-Handed, which I mentioned earlier, so that we can get Orbs of Power all the time, and then we have Impact Induction, which is incredibly good. Anytime we damage enemies with a melee, it's going to reduce our grenade, and this also works whenever your melee is on cooldown. You can just use a normal melee, so you can get your grenade back pretty frequently with this. I do think that this is better than using Font of Focus, and it's harder to fit Font of Focus, because this only costs 1 with the artifact mod that reduces grenade energy. Then we have Font of Vigor. You could certainly not use this if you have like 100 strength by default, but unless you have 100 strength, definitely slap this on and try to aim for around 70 strength. When it comes to the chest, you just want to put on the obvious resist mods, depending upon what you're doing. If you have low resilience, I would recommend putting on Font of Endurance here in the 3rd slot, or alternatively, if you're doing very high-end, harder content and you want even more survivability, I'd recommend putting on Emergency Reinforcement, which is basically just Charge with Light, and just take the stat mod off. But I wasn't doing anything difficult, so I didn't put that there. I could just slap on a Strand mod, whatever, it doesn't matter. Oh, I guess I could do a Reserve mod, actually. I'm stupid. Yeah, Strand Reserves, or Void Reserves, nice. Okay, when it comes to the boots, this is where you're going to have weapon surges. So basically, you're going to gain a small weapon damage bonus for whatever, element type. if you have armor charges, and it's just going to last for the entire duration of your armor charge. If you are curious, 1 stack of this mod gives you 10%, 2 stacks gives you 17%, and 3 gives you 22%. So if I were to equip 2 stacks of, if I were to do Strand twice, why does this one cost 3? Okay. If I were to do Strand twice, this would be giving me 17% damage, and then a third time, this would be giving me 22%. However, I don't really think it's all that worth doing that, especially because I'm going to complain about Strand weapons later. Ultimately, I would recommend using Void weapons and probably just do 1 Void, 1 Strand, but also you're getting your main survivability through using Better Already. Anytime we pick up an orb, it's going to immediately start our health regen. This is our main source of healing because we're creating so many orbs with our melee. We pick up an orb and it's basically like having 100 recovery mid-combat. Very, very, very powerful mod. So I'd recommend only having 1 of each weapon surge. If you're using 2 different types of elements, just have 1 of each. However, if you're using like only Void or only Strand, obviously slap on 2 of the same. Holster mods and scav mods are pretty good. Holster is really good, and it even works on rockets, which I really like, but ultimately having the 17% extra weapon damage all the time, I think is really, really strong. Comes to the class item, this one is pretty straightforward. You want to go for a stat mod, whatever. Bomber is really good, so anytime we use our class ability, it reduces our grenade. Same thing with distribution, but it reduces all cooldowns, and same thing with outreach, but it reduces just the melee. Alternatively, if you want to have higher uptime on armor charges so that you can do more damage with your weapons and you gain, basically the only benefit of having higher uptime on this is so that you have higher uptime on your fonts and also your void weapon surges or whatever. I would just replace distribution with time dilation, and this makes armor charges last from 10 seconds to 15 seconds. None of the other mods I think are all that worth it. Font of Restoration is decent for survivability, but not a big deal. Alright, so now I get to go on a little bit of a tangent when it comes to the artifact mod. So originally when I read Allied Unraveling, I thought that this would mean that Strand weapons would just be super meta the entire time, because basically it would mean that any Strand weapon is going to permanently have Unraveling rounds, which counts as a debuff, which would then spawn tangles every time that you get a kill, okay? So you get rapid weapon kills, get Unraveling rounds, that does AoE, every kill you get would spawn a tangle, and then you boom, pair that with Untangler. Destroying a tangle suspends a target's damage by it, pair that with Threaded Blast, and you just have insane AoE with, you know, spamming your weapon and just blowing tangles up like crazy. The fact is though, Tangle has a 15-second cooldown every time that you proc one. So you'd only get to take advantage of this wombo combo basically every 15 seconds. On top of that, I don't know about you guys, but I have a Strand auto rifle and oh my god, it sucks. I think that I would be way more inclined to use this combination and actually think that it's pretty good once I had a more comprehensive setup. But my main problem is that we're going to be spawning all these tangles anyways on cooldown with our melee. So it's a little bit counterintuitive to the build because we're going to spawn the melee and on a guy that we just killed, and the tangle's going to spawn in our hands. And we'd rather use that tangle to throw it down into the ground and get energy back rather than try to shoot it with our gun and try to like get some blow up damage. I think that if you wanted to go for a pure gun build, that's a whole separate thing and that would be good. And you could even still use a Strand gun with this build. But ultimately, I think it's way better to just use authorized mods void and then, sorry, where is it? Volatile flow, where whenever you pick up an orb of power, boom, your void weapons gain volatile. So you can pretty much just have volatile, get void weapon extra damage, and still play on Strand. I think ultimately that's the best thing to do until everybody gets really good Strand weapons and until we have a better way to use this. But with the build synergy, I just don't think, like with wanting to spam your melee, I really don't think that having the Unraveling rounds is all that good. It does provide a decent amount of AoE, just the Unraveling rounds by itself without pairing it with all of the Tangle stuff. So if you're interested in using a Strand weapon, I definitely still think that it's good if you have a good one and if you just, you know, are sick of using void weapons. But ultimately, for the time being, until we get access to the new fragments, I do think that the best thing to do is put on a good old Fennel Web, put on a Wither Horde in your primary or something, and take advantage of volatile rounds and just put on double Void Surge and maybe, you know, any rocket or literally any Void Heavy that you want. One thing that could be particularly good when it comes to weapons, if you have a really bad, if you don't have any Strand weapon at the moment, using Traveler's Chosen, it actually has Osmosis on it, and it's going to give you a whole bunch of ability energy back. So if you're able to use your grenade frequently enough, you can get pretty good uptime on having this be Strand, and then you pair that with that mod, and you can get some Unraveling rounds, and that would be pretty good. Obviously, Quicksilver Storm, if you're able to grind out the Catalyst, is going to be Strand, although I don't think that weapon will be that good. Of course, you could just use literally any other Osmosis primary if you happen to have a good SMG with that. And then I would recommend just pairing that, even if you wanted to use Strand, I would highly recommend pairing it with something like a Null Composure or any sort of Void weapon so that you can take advantage of both Volatile Flow and Strand, because you can do both of them at the same time. Then for your heavy, literally just use whatever you want. The build isn't really reliant on any sort of weapons. You can kind of just use whatever you want. Just keep in mind that there's not a ton of good Strand options, so kind of just play around with it and use whatever you want. Sorry if this video was all over the place. I am all over the place. I am very tired. I need to get this video out there. Hopefully you did enjoy. I'll leave a link to the build in the description so that everybody can just, copy paste it. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's pretty strong. I'm excited to see it get better. My initial thoughts that, Strand is not as good as other stuff, but I do think that when we get the new fragments and everybody kind of figures stuff out, it'll be pretty strong, especially pair that with getting maybe a potentially good Strand weapon. I think that the builds definitely have some potential, and it's a lot of fun to play with the grapple. I mean, that's kind of my favorite part. The melee does a ridiculous amount of damage too. But like I said, I'll make a way more in-depth and actually good video that isn't complete lazy crap like this one is. I'll make a good one once the new fragments and once the raid is over and stuff, and I have a much more time to dedicate to it. Until then, I will probably make a video on Hunter tomorrow, Warlock the day after. I'll make a video going over all of the mods, and I'll make a video on pretty much every other build. So if you're interested, make sure to subscribe, drop a like, let me know in the comments how you feel about the build, any suggestions that you have, and yeah, we'll see you guys later. Peace.